Excellent. Good morning, folks, and very welcome to this JTD Joining the Dots webinar as we kick off a new series for 2025. So happy new year to all of you, and thank you very much for coming to join us. We're expecting around 100 today, and I can see that we're up to about half of that number already. So well done to those of you who've joined us suitably promptly, and I imagine that there will be some others who come in through the lobby in the next few minutes. So for those who don't know me, my name is Dan Campsall. I'm the chair of Agilysys. I wear a couple of other hats as well. I'm also the chair of the Parliamentary Advisory Council for Transport Safety and involved in the Prince Michael Awards. And as I say, we're kicking off a new sort of mini series associated with the Joining the Dots conference, which is coming up in March, and as part of Road Safety GB's National Analysts Network, which we've been running for a number of years. And what we thought would be good to launch into the start of this year was a series on target setting and safety performance indicators. And one of the reasons this is some topic areas that we've touched on in a number of webinars and conference sessions and things over the years. But over the last 30 years or so, our approach to road safety has been changing to reflect our understanding of the road network as a complex system, and actually developing a much clearer sense of that, there are just so many influences on our road networks, how it's engineered, the economic purpose that it serves, the social space that it provides, that we do have to change our approach to how we intervene within that network. And if we've got an ambition to eradicate death and life-changing injury, then that means that we need to take a different approach to the way in which we manage the roads from what has been our historical norm. So increasingly over, as I say, the last sort of 3 decades or so, you will have come across terms like the road safety management system, or management by results, or the performance management framework. And those are some of the things that we're going to start to dig into a little bit today. Essentially, what are the outcomes that we are looking for our road network to deliver, i.e. mobility that is safe, that is sustainable, and that is inclusive? And how do we know that we're actually making progress towards that overall ambition? So in this series, we're going to be exploring some key questions around what we should be measuring, and indeed how we should be measuring it if we want to understand the intrinsic safety of our road networks and ascertain whether we are making the progress that we hope to be making. So we will be looking at target setting and safety performance indicators. Now, you might be sitting there going, oh, target setting, how quaint. I mean, like, we were doing that in 2010, right? Yes. That is the last time that we had national targets here in Great Britain. And that is quite a long time ago. That's like before the London Olympics happened. That's before Prince William and Kate Middleton even got married. But despite the fact that we haven't had targets in GB for much of that period, the world of road safety and international applications of this sort have been moving forward. So in this 3-part series, we are going to be looking at the global picture, what's happening, and then starting to dig into what that might mean for us here in Great Britain, and indeed in terms of sub-national partnerships. So I'm delighted to be joined by some great colleagues to help us to dig into that today. So on our panelists, our presenters for today, we've got Jenny Carson, who is a project manager with the European Transport Safety Council. ETSC is kind of like a sister organisation to PACT, and was set up to help to advance transport safety across Europe, not just the European Union. So she's a project manager there, works on the PIN reports, which many of you will have come across, sort of comparisons of performance between countries across Europe. And we're also joined by Jess Trong. Jess, I was joking with her before we started that, she's like sort of the world leader of road safety, involved in the Towards Zero Foundation and Global NCAP, but also actually a consultant through company that she runs with Johan Strandroth called Lostinger. I'm sure she'll say a little bit about that. So fantastic contributions for today. And I'm actually going to hand over to Jess to begin with. Can I just encourage you? The value of these webinars really comes from you guys participating and engaging with us. So there's a Q&A button, at least there should be, on your Teams toolbar. And if you've got any questions that you want to put to Jess or to Jenny throughout the time that we're spending together over the next hour or so, please do get those in. And then my job will be to try and make sure that we can address as many of your questions as possible after their presentations. But without further ado, let me hand over to Jess to lead off with the first of those presentations. So Jess, very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'm just going to try and share my screen and make sure my presentation is working. Just checking you can see that, Dan? Everyone can see that?
Perfect. That's working for me.
Awesome. Great. Happy New Year, everyone. And just a very big thank you to Dan and the team.
Jess, actually, you've just now placed the team screen over the top of your presentation. At least that's how it looks for me.
Oh, okay. You don't want to see yourself?
Well, no, in all honesty. I'd much rather see your presentation. So go for it. That's great.
Can you still see yourself? No, that's okay.
No, I can't see myself. I can see your slides.
Okay, great. Excellent. Let's start again. Happy New Year, everyone. And I just want to say a very big thank you to the team at Agilicis and Dan for inviting me to take part in this webinar. I've got a lot of thoughts on target setting, and I just wanted to share my perspective on target setting and maybe some of the issues that sort of go hand in hand along with target setting when we're working towards developing road safety strategies and looking at different ways of being able to reach that target. Sort of like what Dan touched on earlier, I think target setting is not something new for a lot of us. Many of us have worked with target setting a lot in the past, especially if you've been involved in road safety strategy and action plan development. Many jurisdictions and countries would often set a road safety target, every 5 or 10 years in different percentage reduction terms. Some of the more well-known ones that I think many on this call are very familiar with is that the global plan and the Decade of Action road safety target for us by 2030 is to actually have a 50% reduction in fatalities and injuries. And that's been the goal for the last decade and also for this coming decade. But more ambitiously, there are also a lot of countries and jurisdictions around the world that is aiming for more than just that 50% reduction. Many of them are actually setting a date, a year, in which they would hope to be able to reach zero road trauma by. And here are just a few examples of jurisdictions, regions around the world that have committed to actually achieving zero by a set date. So there's quite a number of jurisdictions in Australia, such as Victoria, that is aiming for zero by 2050. New South Wales, also in Australia, was aiming for zero by 2056, but I think they've recently revised that down to 2050 as well. Also in Europe, the US, they are also aiming for zero by 2050. So more and more countries and jurisdictions are becoming more ambitious and looking beyond just the intermediate target of where we want to be in 5-10 years time, but also looking at ultimately where do we want to be by a set date. And thankfully, that is zero road fatalities and injuries. There's a lot of good background and reason for why we should be setting ambitious targets. And firstly, I guess one of the most important thing is actually setting a focus on where do we ultimately want to be in a road safety context? Where do we want to ultimately end up in, our journey in reducing road trauma? And that helps us focus on that ultimate target. And for a lot of jurisdictions around that world, that ultimate target is zero by a set date, which is fantastic. We then know where that final destination is and where we want to be. And then that also starts putting intermediate targets, such as the 50% by 2030 reduction, in context. We know, okay, we want to be at zero by 2050 and we want to have that 50% reduction by 2030. So it starts to make sense when we start looking at it in that context. We start to put that intermediate target in context. But it's important to have that ultimate target because intermediate targets sometimes tend to focus on short-term interventions and solutions, which may be good for a short period of time, but it does end up leaving sometimes a big residual problem that is not taken into consideration when we only focus on short-term solutions. So it's also, that's why we say it's good to have that ultimate target and then intermediate targets on the way in that journey to that ultimate destination. And of course, having these ambitious targets helps drive policy programs and innovations. It makes people a little bit more creative, a little bit more motivated to do something different in order to make these ambitious targets a reality. And it also helps mobilize stakeholders and encourage cooperation because in this journey towards these targets, it's not a solo journey. We need each other. We need to be able to collaborate and work together. So having these targets helps drive a lot of this ambition, but also coordination and cooperation. But is having a target enough? Is it, to be honest, I don't think it's that difficult just to say, let's have a 50% reduction in the next 5 years, next 10 years. Let's aim for zero by this date. I mean, a lot of that is just ambition. But, going hand in hand with that ambition should be a very clear understanding of what it would take to actually help us get to that target. And in road safety terms, it would really be understanding, well, okay, it'll be great to have zero or 50% reduction, but what does that road system need to look like in order for us to be able to achieve those reductions and that ultimate zero? We need to start to understand, how do we want to move people? Where do we want to move people? How do we move people safely? And what parts of the system needs to be strengthened? Which parts of the system needs to be transformed? And these are the important questions that we need to consider in addition and in parallel to setting these ambitious targets, because only then will we understand, well, are these targets actually achievable? And one way to be able to do that is actually going right back to the basics around Vision Zero and the safe system. How do we build that safe transport system in order to meet our ambitious targets? And, as a part of my PhD, I was looking into this in depth. And, Vision Zero originally had very detailed steps on helping us how to build that system in order to get to zero road fatalities and injuries. And it's all about understanding, who are we designing this system for? What are we trying to move? What level of health loss we're willing to accept? And protecting the least protected in our system, and basically energy management so that no one will die or be seriously injured. So we can take these steps and actually start turning it into a bit of a guide in how to build that system in order to be able to meet our ambitious targets. And one of the key aspects of being able to build a system that can meet our injury reduction targets is understanding how to manage energy within our system effectively. So this particular graph up here is a simplistic diagram of what the maximum impact speeds are for different crash types. This particular graph I've been using for a long time, and it's a bit old now, but it gives you an understanding of, okay, what are the maximum speeds that we can design our system for? And using that as a bit of a design factor when we design our intersections, when we design our highways and design our pedestrian priority areas. But like I said, this is a bit outdated now, and there's a lot more information and better research out there that helps us understand even more in depth for the different crash types and different configurations of crash types, what that maximum safe traveling speed and maximum impact speed should look like for different parts of our system. So in order for us to be able to meet our targets, we need to be able to design a system that can manage the energy to within these levels that are very clear from, recent research. And this is a more detailed slide, I guess, looking at once again, just highlighting, we've got very good data now to understand the different car to pedestrian crashes, car to bicycle crashes. What are the maximum impact speeds that we can allow before people become seriously injured or die? And if we can start designing our system according to these energy management principles, we can then have a chance at being able to meet our injury reduction targets that we've set. And I realize there's a slide missing, but one of the most effective ways of doing that is using a process called backcasting. But backcasting is a concept that started in the energy sector, and some of you may have heard about it before, but it's really about starting with the endpoint in mind. Where do we want to be in, say, 2050? What do we want our future to look like? And envisaging what that safe road system would look like before we move backwards and start looking at the priorities that we need to set in the 10, 20, 30 years in the lead up to that ultimate future. And it's a very effective way to help us understand what our key priorities need to be in the next 5, 6 decades. So while we will also understand what our short-term immediate needs need to be, we also then start to understand what that parallel system needs to be in place in order to be able to meet our long-term objectives as well. So backcasting has been used in road safety for the last 3 to 5 years by a lot of leading jurisdictions to help them with their target setting as well as action plan and strategy development. And this is an example here that I've got from New Zealand, and it is really about overlaying the safety aspects on top of their mobility needs. It's all about understanding, where do we want our pedestrians to be the main focus? Where do we want to be, have our freight and moving traffic and people? It's understanding where we want our system to be able to move people most effectively, move vehicles most effectively, and then more importantly, how do we make sure we can do that in a safe way? And if we do it in this particular process, we can not only be able to meet our mobility objectives, we'll also be able to meet our safety objectives. So this is one of the benefits of using backcasting to help set targets, but also setting out what that ultimate system needs to look like in order to be able to meet that target. And really, the steps to being able to build that system based on that mobility needs is really understanding what is that jurisdiction's focus. Are we wanting to have more pedestrians and cyclists, or are we wanting to be more car-centric? And that is not a judgment on what a jurisdiction wants to do. It's really understanding what a jurisdiction needs to do, and then understanding how do we overlay the safety on top of that through energy management, and then designing a safe system and state that can meet both the mobility and safety needs that have been specified. And this is an example of going through that backcasting process and designing what that safe system needs to look like in 2050 for New Zealand. As you can see, you can get down to quite a detailed level of specifying what those highways need to look like. What are what are we trying to move? Who are we trying to move? And then what are the safety features that need to be inbuilt into the system in order to be able to meet the mobility and safety needs. And you go through and you do that for every part of the system. And, this is just a more in-depth look at, say, like a pedestrian priority area. You can specify whether you want to allow vehicles or is it a vehicle-free zone. And then from there, you understand, okay, what sort of vehicle requirements do we need? We need to make sure all the cars have AEB that can, stop crashes with pedestrians and cyclists. We need ISA to help manage speed. but we also need to make sure that in terms of infrastructure, there's off-road separated lanes for cyclists to be able to, move about safely, and, and what the maximum travel speed requirements would be. And what this gives us then is essentially a blueprint for every part of the system, so we can start building that system. And then once again, backcasting, this is the ultimate system that we need in 2050. What do we need to do in 2030 in order to have a 50% reduction and another 50% reduction by 2040? It essentially provides a blueprint for us in what needs to be done in the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years, depending on when you set your date for zero. And it's very easy just to say, okay, we want this system and this is what it should look like. But of course, in order for us to understand, well, is the system that we've designed, is it actually going to meet our 2050 target? Is it going to help us meet our 2030 target? Well, then if we want to understand that, we need to validate that system through some statistical and case-by-case analysis. And this is another example from New Zealand where we did that. We designed the system, we helped them look at whether or not it would help them meet that zero target by 2050. And we found that about 87% of all fatalities can be prevented by the safe system end state that has been designed. And we also then can dig deeper into the data and understand, well, what are the fatalities that can't be prevented at this point in time? And you can see that we're doing a deep dive into the residual fatalities. A lot of it ends up being vulnerable road users, so motorcyclists, cyclists, pedestrians. And what that ends up telling us is that, okay, the system that we have and perhaps the solutions that we have currently available may not be as sufficient in addressing vulnerable road user fatalities as it is for car occupant fatalities. And then we can understand what innovations are needed in order to be able to close that gap so that the remaining residual 13% can also be prevented. And I mean, the good news is, having undergone this process for a number of jurisdictions, we understand that 80 to 90% of all fatalities and serious injuries can be prevented by just using currently available measures. So all jurisdictions around the world currently, if we're just looking at what, the fatalities and injuries we've got on the road today, pretty much 90% of them can be prevented just by the things that we have in our toolbox right now. We don't have to wait for autonomous cars. We don't have to wait for further innovations. We can reduce up to 90% of all these FSIs already. And of course, to close that remaining 10, 20% gap to 100% reduction, would then start need to look at innovations and looking at other measures that we may need to bring in to be able to close that gap 100%. And through this, we can start looking at the reasons why we may not be reaching our target by 2030 or 2050. And you can see when we did a deep dive in the New Zealand data, a lot of it has to do with implementation, especially in the lead up to 2030, where we're looking at a 50% reduction. We're not getting to that 50% reduction in our target because jurisdictions are not implementing as fast as they can. It means that there is an available and effective road safety measure, but jurisdictions are not implementing it. You can see that there are very few, even at 2030, 2050, where there's no intervention available at all. And that sort of resonates with the 10, 20%, that gap that still needs to be closed. But mainly, the reason why we're not seeing as fast a progress as we would like in achieving that 2030 target is because we're not implementing fast enough or not implementing at all. And for us to start closing that gap to the 50% reduction target, and of course, in the lead up to 2050 and zero as well, we need to start understanding, okay, this is where we want to be in 2030 and 2050, but where are we currently sitting at? And this is why when you start setting targets, it's really good to do a gap analysis to understand where you are currently and where you want to be in 2030 or 2050. And the good thing about doing a gap analysis is you would start to see where are the gaps that needs to be closed, but more importantly, start to be able to quantify the amount of work that needs to be done to start closing those gaps. So once again, it's great to set targets. It's great to say 50% reduction by 2030, but do we know how much work it's going to take to close that gap between where we are now and where we want to be in 2030? For us to understand that, we need to know what is that system we're trying to build and quantify the amount of work that is ahead of us, so we can then start to understand, is that 50% reduction actually a feasible target, and whether or not we're willing to invest in actually closing that gap. So this is a really important step in the process of target setting as well. And then once you start to quantify and understand how much work is ahead of you, you can start doing some modeling to understand the strategic response that jurisdictions need to put together. And this is essentially using it to help design your action plans and investment scenarios, understanding, okay, if we're willing to invest 500 million over the next 10 years up to 2030 to transform our highways or to improve vehicle safety standards, where will that get us? What if we reduce that investment to 200 million? Or what if we ramp up implementation by another 50%? You can start playing around with those strategic responses and different scenarios to help you understand in the pathway to 2030 and 2050, how much investment we would need to make and how much work are we willing to put in, and where that will take you in terms of meeting your targets at those respective dates. So this is a nifty little way of understanding how much work and how much investment would be needed in different points of time, depending on how much you're willing to put in. And of course, once you have your action plan, once you've got your targets and all that, we need to make sure we understand, are we actually tracking, and are we tracking well to actually meeting those targets, but also understanding, are we actually tracking well in transforming that system to the 2030 system that we want and the 2050 system that we want in order to meet the 2030 and 2050 road safety targets. So you need to start setting some key performance indicators for your roads. All roads above 80 kilometers has to have side and mid barriers, maybe making sure that vehicles that are coming onto your roads have the appropriate vehicle safety technologies, such as autonomous emergency braking and intelligent speed assist. You need to start tracking then, well, what level of penetration do we have of these technologies? What proportion of our highways are actually meeting the safety requirements that we've set out in our safe system and state? If you don't track, if you don't measure, you're not going to know whether your system is being transformed, how much is being transformed by, and how likely it is to help you meet your targets that you've set. And I guess that is just a very quick overview in a nutshell of what we're looking at when we say it's important to have targets, but it's not the only thing that matters in the journey towards reaching those targets. We need to make sure we've got a process that runs parallel to that, so that we're also transforming the road safety system in a way that can help us meet those targets. And this is just a quick summary of some of the steps that I've highlighted. So thank you for your time.
That's fantastic. Thanks for that, Jess. So some questions already started to come in. I'm going to move fairly quickly to Jenny's presentation, but I just wanted to James asked about calculations for motorcyclists, and then you also showed the residual piece around motorcyclists. So I wondered whether you talked a little bit about vehicle occupants, you talked about pedestrians and cyclists, but you did miss out the powered two-wheeler element, and just wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of say, how do you see that within the context of the work that you've been doing?
Yes, motorcyclists was most definitely considered as a part of the overall system, because obviously if we want a system that can accommodate everyone, motorcyclists is most definitely a part of that jigsaw puzzle. And they are proving to be a challenge in the whole safe system context. You know, we've got a lot more solutions that can effectively address car occupant related fatalities and serious injuries compared to motorcyclists at the moment. And through the research that we've been doing, it shows that a lot of the residual trauma that we're seeing are often motorcyclist related, because we can't guarantee that they'll definitely wear protective clothing, wear protective helmets. And when they can't come off a bike without a helmet, that's unfortunately most likely going to result at least in a serious injury. So one of the gaps and in our understanding in terms of designing that safe system remains squarely focused on motorcyclists at this point in time, and we're doing further research into that area now. Having said that, though, even with just the solutions we have, you know, 60 to 70% of all motorcyclist fatalities and injuries can be reduced right now, just with implementing what we know. So while the gap is a lot bigger for motorcyclists, we can still do a lot in the meantime to reduce the fatalities and injuries that we are seeing right now.
Great, fantastic. Thanks for that. So, yes, many questions. Certainly, I've got a whole bunch of questions I'd love to explore, but I have to remember it's not all about me. So I'm going to hand over now to Jenny, and Jenny's going to help us to think about how this is operating, particularly within the European context, from the work that ETSC are doing. So, Jenny, very warm welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Is that, can you see my screen okay?
So at the moment, I'm seeing the editor view rather than the slideshow view. So I can see the slides, but I'm not it. I think you might need to switch the screens.
Oh no, sorry. I don't know how to do that.
So if you go to share content,
maybe if we share entire
do you have
screen.
the option to share PowerPoint live? Because that's often the best way.
I don't, but if I do it like this, does it work?
Yeah.
Yes, that's working.
Perfect.
Great.
All right.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Thanks for inviting me to talk a little bit about what we know about target setting in the European context. As Dan said, I'm Jenny Castle and I'm Project Manager at the European Transport Safety Council in Brussels, primarily focusing on the PIN programme, the Road Safety Performance Index programme, and I'll talk a little bit about that now. So our PIN program, a lot of what I'm going to say, a lot of the data, the information that we have actually comes from what we've gathered within the PIN program. So I'll just say a little bit about that. In itself, it's, you know, as Dan said, it's a benchmarking program very much focused on indicators as well. So it's relevant in that context. But it's basically a project program that's been running since 2006 that involves 32 countries, so the 27 EU member states, but also the UK, Norway, Switzerland, Israel, and the Republic of Serbia. And what we do really is we look at the road safety performance of those countries, focusing primarily on road deaths and serious injuries. And yeah, we benchmark them. You can see there the map, we use sort of traffic light colours to benchmark the countries. But it's also a forum where we seek to inspire by giving a prize and for learning from each other. So in all our reports, we include lots of good practices, things that have worked, so that countries can learn from each other as well. And we produce a number of reports every year, and on the bottom there you can see the sponsors of the program. So a lot of what I'll show will be from PIN reports. That's just what I wanted to say at the beginning. So what can we say about road safety strategies, road safety target setting in the EU context? So we are in Brussels, obviously, the European Union is very much in our forethoughts, and we have at the European level, we have two sort of key documents regarding performance measuring. And as Jess said, the EU also has a long-term goal of zero road deaths by 2050, and then the 50% reduction target by 2030 in both road deaths and serious injuries. And the serious injuries is new for the 2020-2030 decade. So that came out in the Action Plan for Road Safety, and it was followed up a year later in 2019 with this sort of policy framework document. And here the European Union outlined the 8 key performance indicators that they were going to use to measure and sort of monitor and assess progress in road safety in the EU member states. So they chose 8 initially. You can see them there: speed, safety belt, protective equipment, alcohol distraction, vehicle safety, infrastructure, and post-crash care. And they're very much about monitoring and assessing progress. And I'll say a little bit more about them later on. So if we look, Jess has gone into a very deep dive into what actually measuring road safety performance is all about. At a bit of a higher level, I think there's sort of key elements in terms of making your targets effective, and obviously going down again to all the great points that Jess made. But really they need to be set in a strategy. If you're going to have targets, you need to have a strategy as to how you're going to achieve them, and you really need to monitor the progress as you go along as well. But I think it's also important that you have sort of high political backing, that those strategies, those targets don't sit in a drawer gathering dust, but that they are given prominence and political support. Also, very much what Jess was just saying, the actions that you take, the targets that you set have to be very much based on evidence in terms of, are they going to solve the problems or the targets that you want to achieve? And at the European level, quite a particular issue, something that's very important, is the idea of common definitions, that we're all measuring the same thing, so that really we can compare better between the 27 EU countries. But that's perhaps something quite particular to the European Union. So I mentioned there the need for a good strategy. This is from our PIN annual report, which we publish every year in June. We asked our PIN countries whether they had a road safety strategy, whether they had in that strategy a road death reduction target, and also a serious injury reduction target. And you can see on this slide and across the next one that the majority of them do. A lot of them have adopted the sort of overall EU target of reducing by 50% both the road deaths and serious injuries, but not all of them. Some of them have given a numerical figure that they want to achieve by 2030. So it's a real mixture. Some dates are a bit different, not the whole decade. So it's a mixture of approaches. Some of them you'll see there that they've taken 2019 as their benchmark year for the 50% reduction. That I think most people know that because 2020 obviously was a COVID year, people are taking 2019 as their benchmark. So this is all data that you can find in our PIN annual report, and there's a link to that at the end of my presentation. So that's the strategy. I just wanted to say that the EU is also looking at these national road safety strategies to see, monitoring them to see if they're achieving the goal, if they are, how they're contributing to achieving the EU goals as well of reductions in road deaths. And that's something that I believe just started last year, and they're going to be carrying on developing this tool to try and monitor the implementation of those national strategies to see how they're getting on. So the European Union is taking an interest in the national strategies as well. So I mentioned the 8 key performance indicators that the European Union introduced in 2019 in their policy document, and they were initially chosen as the ones that contribute the sort of the factors that are most associated with crash and injury risk, and ETSC very much welcomed them when they were initially published. They're a very good set of indicators. We did publish a report once they'd been released, to say how we felt perhaps they could be improved. But if you want to know that, then please let me know and I can share that with you afterwards. We welcome KPIs because we know that, as Jess said, they give you a more complete picture of your road safety situation. They allow you to monitor. They can highlight when issues are sort of occurring. They can highlight that early on, and you can adapt and make changes as possible. So we very much welcome them. Later on, just quite recently, the European Union has also now been looking at some other key performance indicators. They're calling them experimental, just to see how feasible it is to gather this data and have these KPIs at a European level. We were particular, these are the ones that they've decided to look at sort of from an experimental point of view. And we at ECSC were particularly pleased to see that they'd included enforcement there, because that was one of the ones that we felt was lacking from the initial 8. But as I say, there's no target set for these indicators. They're currently only really for monitoring purposes. So the European Union has been helping member states to collect this key performance indicators, the data associated with them, in 2 projects, supporting them with defining the minimum methodological requirements. So what are they actually collecting for each key performance indicator? So that those values are then comparable across countries. I mentioned that before. And also helping with capacity building in member states where the data, this key performance indicator, didn't previously exist, and helping them to do that. And that first project has been extended, and now there are many more member states are involved. Again, the focus is very much on helping to collect the data for each of the key performance indicators. And now they're also looking, as I mentioned, at those experimental ones. So when it comes to road safety objectives, I just wanted to talk about a report that the EU Court of Auditors published in April last year, really looking at the EU's road safety objectives and whether we're on track to achieve them. And there were some criticisms in terms of data comparability, particularly related to KPIs, but also serious injuries. So the definition for serious injuries at the European level is an injury of MIS 3+, but not all member states can collect that data. So there's not only an issue with collecting KPI data, but also serious injury. So it was a criticism that this insufficient sort of data comparability at the European level was kind of hindering the ability to track progress. But as I mentioned, the European Commission responded to that report, and they are now monitoring progress of the national road safety strategies, and they're supporting the member states, as I mentioned, with the 2 projects on the key performance indicators, and also with the serious injury definition. We're trying to support them to collect MIS 3+ data. So I wanted just to talk about 2 countries that have sort of the strategies of two road safety strategies of two EU countries that could be perhaps seen as good practices. Sweden, I noticed Jess had a Swedish example in her presentation as well. It's quite often held up as a good practice. So Sweden takes the approach of management, road safety management by objectives, and it's a very systematic approach of measuring and tracking. They have these three different indicators. So outcome indicators in terms of road deaths and serious injuries, system indicators in terms of the design, safe roads, safe vehicles, and use indicators in terms of how how people use those the roads. So we're looking at speed limits, drink driving, etc. Each of the indicators that they have has a 2030 target. They were the indicators were all chosen through following sort of modeling to see which indicators they needed, and the indicators are all reported on every year in this report you can see here for 2022. And analysed and addressed. So it's a very systematic, sort of systemic approach to road safety. I wanted to also talk about Ireland's road safety strategy, which is also considered, I think, often a good practice. They have the 2030 target, reduction target, obviously 50%, the 2050 vision zero. They have also chosen their 15 safety performance indicators. They call them safety performance indicators rather than KPIs. And they had also, you can see here, this interim target of 2024 for the numbers of road deaths and serious injuries. But their SPIs, their indicators, don't have targets attached to them. So they're very much for monitoring and assessing. So I just wanted to end with some comments from ETSC on road safety targets, performance measurement. So we obviously call on national governments to adopt road safety plans to include key performance indicators with targets attached to them, to this monitoring of road safety strategies is taking place. We call on member states to engage with it, to see where they are, what their how their strategy is going, and we encourage them to also collect data for the EU key performance indicators, the 8 that I mentioned before, and call on the European Union to continue to support member states in doing that work. When it comes to the 8 key performance indicators that I mentioned, the EU had assessed. I said that we had quite a detailed response to that document when it was published. We asked if they could consider expanding the list. We now know that they have these experimental ones, which, like I said, is taking on enforcement. We asked for them whether it can be possible to introduce targets based on those KPIs. If we look at an indicator, then perhaps we could have a progress over time indicator, but also an outcome indicator, something that we do in our PIN reports. If you're going to set KPI targets, why not look at the performance of the best 3 performing countries? Obviously, for that, you're going to have common data collection methodologies, and publish this data, make it available for us to see. They have a road safety conference every year. Why not publish it there? So we had quite a detailed response on the EU KPIs. So that's it. Thank you very much. There you can see the link to the PIN program and the road safety performance report that we publish in June each year. Thanks.
Great stuff. Thank you, Jenny. First quick question, actually, just whilst you're removing that screen share, from Victoria National Highways, which is about simply how do we stay abreast of the road safety performance monitoring tool that you discussed? Is that something that's accessible and available for people to connect with?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's currently being developed, and I can't remember when they are going to publish it, but it's certainly something that we'll look at ETSC. So if you follow us at ETSC, we'll certainly make it public once it's been published. And I can send the details of the project that's doing the work as well, if anyone wants to get in touch with me afterwards.
Great, thank you. Jess, if I can encourage you to come back, and we've just got sort of the last 10 minutes or so to explore some of the questions that have been raised by participants, but also by your content. And one of the things that struck me, Jenny, actually just in your presentation and a theme through what both of you said, was that these targets need to be aligned to strategy and implementation. And then we look at all of the target setting that's happening across EU countries. And it's like, well, the EU said we've got to go for 50 by 30. I just wonder whether there's a bit of a danger of target setting being susceptible to almost sort of groupthink at an international level. It's like, well, because the international institutions are saying we should go for this, that's what we're going to go for. But actually, there's not necessarily the competence and capacity to really deliver that. I just wondered whether you got any thoughts on, are we potentially kind of setting countries up to fail, or are we calling them up to build capacity appropriate to the targets?
Yeah, I mean it's tricky. The EU target that has been adopted by the member states in their own strategies, but I think I hope I'm not wrong in saying this, but I think it's a collective target as well. So it's about everyone doing their bit to try and achieve the collective target. So I think it's, yeah, is it? I think it's, yeah, it's for some people it's, but then we got to 2020 and I think only one member state had actually reduced their 1.5 by 2020. So it's, it's not like everybody's surging. Some people are surging ahead and other people are left behind. Everyone has work to do, I think, and it's an ambition, I think, yeah, for everybody to work with. But I think it's also a collective target as well.
Jess, I don't know whether you want to come in on that as well, but I mean, if I can sort of extend it slightly as well. The ambition, sort of, there are lines on your charts that sort of indicate, this is how we're going to make this linear progress. But we know that actually every additional bit of progress gets harder and harder. So I also wonder, it's like some countries who've made great progress over 30, 40, 50 years, that marginal gains gets more difficult to, how do we reflect that in terms of the shape of progress that we're looking to deliver?
I think having that collective 50% reduction target globally has been fantastic because it is driving greater commitments from governments, hopefully, to do more. So we know that if the target wasn't set, if there was no target in place, a lot of countries would just flounder and just say, okay, we'll just do business as usual. But having that target there actually starts driving people to say, okay, what else do we need to do? What should we implement? But on the flip side of that is really then having a very clear understanding. If 50% reduction is your target, what is it going to take to actually get there? And then it's up to the jurisdictions to have a very good understanding. And that's where we talked about understanding the priorities and the level of investment and the level of work that needs to be done between now and 2030. So it can't just be having that ambition. It's really then understanding what level of money, cost, investment, capacity that would be needed to deliver on that, and whether we're willing to commit to that. And I think for a lot of jurisdictions at the moment, that bit's missing. They've got that ambition, which is fantastic, but have they got the actual details to back up how to plan out that pathway to get there in a systematic fashion of a 50% reduction by 2030? And I think that's where a lot of countries are failing. They don't have a very clear pathway to achieve that reduction. So ambition's great. We should definitely keep that and have that, but it's also making sure we've got that parallel action of understanding what that pathway looks like.
Yeah, great, thank you. So question that Paul Copeland has asked is about persuading political leaders, essentially, central government, but also the public. And I was thinking something similar as you were both presenting, that Vision Zero at one level is fairly straightforward to persuade people into. I was actually with a couple of politicians yesterday who the idea that it is unethical and unacceptable that people die on our roads, that's quite easy to give mental assent to. But then it gets much trickier when you start to say, all right, what does that look like in practice? And I was just wondering, maybe Jess, I'll come back to start with you. Like, how do you win the argument but continue to win the argument when it does get harder to deliver those improvements?
It does. And I think this is where I believe the backcasting process is such an important element when we start talking about target setting and strategy development, because it makes it tangible. It makes the whole concept of zero tangible for people when they start to understand, okay, this is the system that we're building. This is what the safety features need to look like in different parts of the network. If we want to move people, this is what it needs to look like. I mean, otherwise, for a lot of people, Vision Zero is utopia. It's this far out concept. It's an ambition, but no more than that. But to actually make it tangible, to convince politicians, to convince the community, hey, actually, we can systematically build a system to reach this objective, and this is what that system needs to look like. I think once you have a very clear picture of what you're trying to build, it makes it easier to mobilize the resources, mobilize the stakeholders, and get that political support. Otherwise, we're having a discussion around whether zero is possible without understanding the amount of work, the amount of investment, cooperation, and political buy-in that is required. Until we work out those details, we can't have that informed discussion. So I think if we want that political buy-in, if we want that support from the community, we need to understand as practitioners ourselves what it is exactly that we're aiming for past that target of 50 or zero.
Right. I, as ever, feel like we sort of run short on time for the discussion, and there's many questions that I would like to ask, and there's still some in the Q&A that would be great to get to. But I also want to recognise that people have got busy diaries, and I don't want to overstay our welcome in that respect. So I'm just going to draw your attention to the fact that even though we're at the end of our time for this webinar, it's not the end of the discussion. We've got two more Joining the Dots webinars over the next 2 Wednesdays that are going to be digging further into target setting and developing SPIs. So next Wednesday, 2 p.m. and the following Wednesday at 2 p.m. as well. We've got some great guests involved in that, including Walter Vandenberg, who is been involved in both the baseline and trendline projects. If you want to dig into that a little bit more around SPI setting, he'll be at the one in 2 weeks' time. And also just to say that tickets have been selling pretty rapidly this year for the Joining the Dots conference, which will be in Birmingham on the 4th of March. So if you want a whole day of just getting into this stuff, who doesn't, let's face it, then please do mark that out in your diary and make sure that you get a ticket pretty soon, because we'd sold about half the tickets before Christmas, which is means they're flying off the shelves, and it would be well worth you getting in there soon. Steve's dropped the link into the chat for you as well. But it is 12 o'clock, so I don't want to overstay our welcome. So I'm going to draw today's webinar to a close. It just remains for me to say a very, very big thank you to Jess and to Jenny for their time, their expertise invested in sharing with us, and we look forward to seeing you at one of the next 2 webinars as well. But for now, thank you very much and stay safe out there.
Thank you. Bye.